the Arkansas Moderati Podcast. Here we go.
I could not be more continuously irritated by the fact that anytime there's any criticism at all, the governor of this state reflexively calls any critic of her administration or her ideas the radical left. It just makes my skin crawl every time she does it.
Yeah, and I think it's very transparent too. Most people who understand the politics of the state understand that there's probably a handful of 24 radical leftists in this state of 3 million people.
Yeah. I think we saw a polling on this a couple of weeks ago that said that 10% of Arkansas voters identify as Democrats, and then something like 30 or 40% identify as moderates. And I just don't understand why this radical left thing lands. I reject the idea that the 50% of the people in the state that identify as conservatives look at everyone to the left of them and think of them as radicals.
Yeah, I'm not sure that they do. I don't think they do. I think that they're trying to cater to the party base, which they believe is this MAGA group. I tend to believe that it's different. I think the MAGA movement in Arkansas is going to slowly dwindle. I think a lot of people are coming up and saying they watched J6, they watched how things went down during both the indictments, as well as the impeachments, and they're starting to see that the oil salesman is trying to sell snake oil. What I want to focus on when we talk about this stuff is that we do have a big group of pretty responsible, normal, good Arkansas Republicans that are out there who are not radical to the far right as much as most Democrats in the state are not radical to the far left. And I think that piece of the pie, those people who are really good, solid neighbors, friends, people that loan each other tools and go to movies together and things like that, I think
football
those are the Republicans.
Games.
Exactly. So I have a boat, and I have a guy that came down and worked on it over the weekend, and the guy could not be more Republican. He was talking about it and everything, but yet he kept saying, I'm just tired of having to feel like I've got to be angry with people. I'm tired of feeling like I have to hate people. He goes, you seem to be in the middle. And I took that as a compliment because most people say I look like a Republican guy. And he said, the way that I see this is that you and I are down here having a conversation. We're doing business together, and that's just the way it should be. And if I believe one thing and you believe another, what the hell difference does it make? And I just sat there and nodded because it was exactly the truth. Now, his political beliefs couldn't be any farther away from mine, probably, but I don't have to hate him.
But the other thing that I think gets lost in all this talk about left versus right is that there's a fairly new, I think, movement in this country to split each other up into to try to create 100%ers, where it's like we're forced to ignore whatever percentage of things we agree on in the constant pursuit of party purity. You know what I mean? And rather than make progress on the 20 or 30 or 50% of things that we can find common ground on, we stand across the room and look at each other skeptically rather than come together and say, okay, you and I have complete disagreements on these things, but here's a place where we can do the state's business or the country's business, whatever the case may be. And I think if we would get back to a place where we would just make progress on the things we agree with across party lines, then I think it would have kind of a healing effect that would spill over. And suddenly we'd find ourselves able to negotiate on the hard things that we have a more difficult time reaching a consensus on.
Yeah, but it's not going to come, that type of mindset's not going to come from the leadership that we have on the right.
Oh, no, absolutely not.
When I've gone out to several different meetings of Democratic folks in the state, and I'm a pretty deep, thick former Republican, so sometimes that's been a weird experience for me. But when I go and listen to Democrat leaders in the state they talk about bringing people together. They talk about we need to have a little bit more consensus. We need to have an open mind about things. We need to take care of each other. We need to pay for each other's health care when we're having a hard time. We need to feed people when they're hungry. It comes across as very beatitude-ish. It comes across as the way that I would expect religious people to believe. But those folks are not the ones that are trying to control the narrative. My former party is the one that tries to control the narrative, and they do it not by diving into the issues like a Democrat would and being really wonky and trying to prove that they're smarter than everybody else, which unfortunately, I believe that's what a lot of Democrat folks want to do. But they do it by crystallizing these thoughts into 3 to 5 word little themes that can be glommed onto by anybody of any educational level in any place.
Yeah.
And therefore it puts people into buckets. So using the radical left is not because she believes that there's a huge batch of radical left people. She uses it because it's really easy to repeat. And anything that is evil in their eyes, anything that is not aligned with their beliefs, suddenly can be, you can just say, that's the radical left at work. And they want to kill your babies, and they want to be able to kill babies until they're 30 days old out of the womb. And they want to blah, 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 which is absolute insanity.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's a shorthand that they use to signal to their base who they're speaking to and draw some lines. And the boogeymanism that this party has engaged in for the last 20, 30, 40 years, no matter how you want to slice it, I think there was a point where we had some very well-defined external enemies, and that the focus on them kind of kept us from being at each other's throats. And when those external enemies vanished, our politics had functioned that way for so long that we searched around for a new enemy, and over again, the enemy that we found is ourselves.
We started, we got out of World War II, and everybody thought we liked to portray ourselves as very righteous, and then we went into Korea and then to Vietnam. And then that was our enemy, communism behind this proxy in Vietnam and Korea. And then that went away. And then Russia reared its head, and Ronald Reagan said, we need to be afraid of Russia. And the bombs are going to fall any minute. And then Russia fell away. And then it was not even plausible to be afraid of the former Soviet states anymore. So Islam came along, which was a real threat. But still, it was very easy to hate people that are very different. And you could make these 3 to 5 word slogans to
Sharia law.
Make sure Sharia law. You just talk about Sharia law, which has zero chance of being implemented in a place like the United States. And then that kind
by
of
Muslims anyway. We seem to be doing a pretty good job of implementing Sharia law by another name here.
The domestic Sharia law seems to be something that's working these days. But we banished all of these supposed enemies over time. And so we wind up in a place where there's nobody else to hate but each other. Right. Oh, okay, let's hate the baby killers, and let's hate the people who want to bleed the country dry. And so they've been hyper effective at doing this. One thing I admire the Democrats for, and I also think they're stupid for, is the fact that they don't play that game. I like the fact that they don't play that game. They don't get into this, who's the boogeyman and who do we need to hate today? But by the same token, they don't play an alternate game. They've got to find an alternate game of being able to point out ludicrous things as ludicrous when the ludicrous shit happens. And that's what Democrats are not very good at. They're not bloodthirsty about their position. And it's because the left in this country doesn't have a solid base where everybody believes the same 12 things. No. It's a little bit more of a freedom of belief to take and pick and choose and curate what beliefs you want to have, because that's what we are as humans, whereas the Republicans fall in line. And whereas people who 20 years ago said, I think abortion's probably okay in some circumstances, now they say absolutely not in any case, blah, blah, blah. But I think portraying all Republicans as that is incorrect. I think there are as many fence-sitting Republicans out there as there are Democrats that believe in multiple things.
I think moderates tend to swing Republican just because it's a more traditional sounding political philosophy. I think what conservatism means right now, to the party at least, is in flux, and that they're spending an awful lot of time speaking to that MAGA base and taking moderates for granted. Like it's become so tribal, they just expect me to vote with them because I have identified as a moderate, right of center voter for so long that it would be repugnant to me to just pull the other handle. I am waiting for candidates to describe a country that sounds good for me to live in. You know what I mean? I think I approach politics pragmatically. I think there's a certain amount of the politics of the moment involved here where I look around and it's not just a question of the talking points that the party endorses. It's a question of what's going on in the country right now and who is the right person to kind of address the issues that the country is going through at that moment, or the state or whatever. I think that pretty much covers the moderate idea for me. The only thing I would say is that The other issue that I think leftist liberals have is that they come to moderates and ask them to 100% endorse ideas that they've only recently become able to tolerate. And rather than give people a little bit of space and understanding that these are serious issues and that real lives are being affected by these issues, it's still, there's a traditionalism that you can't just by a matter of, you can't offhandedly expect people to just give up the center of their identity.
Yeah, but that's been a way that progressive ideas have actually become more mainstream over time. As an example, like in the 70s and 80s, I can vividly remember my father and my uncle being visibly uncomfortable with interracial marriage.
Sure.
It bothered them.
Yeah, it's not that long ago.
Yeah, because my dad born in the 1920s, and he grew up in a very different America, but he would say, look, I'm not all that comfortable with this, but I know that it's probably right. And I know this is probably where we're headed. So I don't stand in opposition to it. I have weird feelings about it. And at the time, that was seen as a progressive stance. It's like, okay, this guy's trying to bend his ideals and his innermost moral feelings. He's trying to bend them to make sure that he's along the right side of history. But Democrats today are not happy with that. So if the Democrat mindset had been in place back then, there would be people looking at my father and saying, unless you come out and write a 10-page thesis on why interracial marriage is correct, and you go and you hold a sign at every parade we tell you to hold a sign at, then you are a racist. And that is incredibly dangerous for us to move forward, because if somebody had said that to my father, he was a pretty smart guy, but he might have said, screw you, then I'm going to go way back over to the other side and just say that it's absolutely wrong. So progressives, in their quest to make progressive things happen, act in unprogressive ways. Their actions actually have the endpoint of sending people back to where they started from and having them rethink it. Oh, if me thinking this way, if me bending a little bit is going to make me a racist, then I'll just go back to the way that I believed before, because it shouldn't matter. I think Democrats, which fair balance, I was a lifelong Republican until 9/11, but man, since the last 10 years, I've voted almost down ballot everybody from the Democrat side, because I think the GOP is a danger to the Republic. But Democrats don't do this effectively. They don't change hearts and minds effectively. And Joyce Elliott, God, I love her. She stood up in front of everybody and said, if you guys are going to call Republicans racists and inbreds and assholes, we're going to lose every election from now on.
That's Democrats exactly right. That's exactly right. Yeah. I just couldn't agree more with that statement. There's somebody said to us not long ago that Democrats and conservatives don't really speak the same language. Like, it's a genetic difference in the way they absorb information. And I think that's exactly right. And I think so many of these issues to me feel like things that in the classical definition of conservatism would be personal, private issues or freedom issues. There's an opening here for the Democrats to adjust their messaging just a little bit and bring a lot of moderate, middle right people into their, not movement, but to kind of get to a point where they might, in privacy and the darkness of the voting booth, be able to convince themselves to support ideas that are more in line with the type of conservatism. I was always raised that a small government conservative, the centerpiece of that was to keep the government out of your daily lives. And it just feels like there's so many issues now where, 15, 20 years ago, the things we're discussing would have been at home.
In a discussion between people in both parties.
Exactly. That now we've not switched places, but it just doesn't feel like it's. One of the Lincoln Project guys said, how do you turn your back on your most closely held beliefs in such a short period of time? And he said that the obvious answer is that those weren't your most closely held beliefs. It was something that you did to convince people to vote your way. And once it became politically expedient to turn your back on that to catch up with the changes in your base, they did that.
Yeah.
And to back up what you said earlier about being a long-term conservative, that's where I broke with the Conservative Party, was when it became clear that so many of the ideas that they had used to convince me to support them over the years were not things that they really felt strongly about. It was just bumper sticker sloganism and electioneering that they used to convince me to support them so they could get into office and then ignore all of those axioms.
Yeah. A friend of both of ours has a saying, it simplified to the nth degree. It's just, some shit is just not my business.
Yes.
And how you believe on certain things, how a person believes on certain things is just simply not my business. And if you want to go back to what made America great, which one of the things that made America great is that there were just certain things that there was just not much use talking about. If you had a neighbor who was a good neighbor, who watched your stuff, who took care of your kids every once in a while, but down deep in their heart, they didn't believe that gay people should have the same rights as others. Yeah, that's not optimal. But at the end of the day, the good in the relationship far outweighed the one issue that you didn't agree on. But where the Democrats have gone wrong and the Republicans have gotten it really right is what our friend consultant told us the other day. So you've got the elitist on one side and you got the assholes on the other side, but the asshole never made me feel stupid.
That's exactly right.
And that's where the MAGA base and maybe the periphery around that has been lost maybe forever, because we stood up and said the things that you believe in are absolutely stupid. Whereas 35 years ago, my dad had beliefs that eventually he and his generation will die out and progress will happen, but yet nobody was sitting there saying he was stupid.
That's how I became a George W. Bush voter. There were plenty of times when Vice President Gore made me feel like I just wasn't clever enough to understand the nuances of his message. And also at that time, there was the PMRC, I felt like they trembled on freedom of speech for artists.
Take that for a second, that you had the de facto second man in charge of the Democratic Party coming out in favor of censorship. Times change, right? Times change pretty dramatically. And we, whether we want to or not, we change along with those times. But what the Republicans have done so effectively is to say that times should not change, and you should not change your beliefs for anything. And this whole concept, people don't understand it because it's so easy to have plausible deniability about the term "Make America Great Again." Why would you not want to make America great again? The whole reasoning behind "Make America Great Again" is to make America great again to the time when blacks knew their place, and if they didn't, they were punished. Gay people stayed in the shadows,
hiding,
people who lived any type of alternative lifestyle or whatever were quashed, and that there was this certain purity about what society did. Guess what? That was made up by Hollywood. Those days never, ever existed.
Yeah, it's easy to talk about the importance of freedom as long as what you're offering is the freedom for everybody to be exactly like you.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Freedom gets a little bit frayed around the edges, and you have to be okay with that. And I naively thought that's what conservatism was selling, was the free, especially for a party that, outwardly endorsed the rugged individualist so often. Apparently, there was only one kind of rugged individualist they were endorsing.
Yeah.
Before we found out that he had AIDS, Rock Hudson was who we were endorsing. The boy next door that never took any extreme or out of the mainstream, I guess is a better way to describe it, viewpoints, and just went along with the flow of whatever the prevailing wisdom at the time happened to be. Anytime you get outside of that stream, you're suddenly a radical leftist now.
That's an interesting seg. Let's talk about the tools that they use. So I just typed in the word radical leftists on Twitter, and the first thing that comes up is a tweet saying radical leftist group is preventing Trump from obtaining top tier lawyers. So this is a tiny tweet in a tiny little sentence that probably a tenth of a percent of Americans will read, but it totally shows how they use language to really create something in your mind. Because if you read that, you're like, yeah, the radical leftist is preventing Trump from obtaining good lawyers. They're doing everything in their power to take our guy down. When the reality is Trump doesn't pay his lawyers,
doesn't take their advice.
Several of them get accused of crimes,
but wait,
and some of them go to jail. And
that's so the operative part, is that he's completely willing to put his lawyers in a place where it's they who have to end up going to jail rather than him. It's like, wasn't me, it was the lawyer, it was Michael Cohen.
Because you know that your favorite president would never do anything illegal.
I would never.
But the use of this language is so critically, like, evilly good, and not good, but proficient and efficient.
Yeah.
That
they've been focus group in how to talk like this for 40 years. I'll go ahead and say we as the left are very, right now, politics of the moment. We're so busy just dealing with what happens day to day that we haven't stopped and created a long-term infrastructure in the same way conservatives have. And conservatives have been at this for a long time.
So now we come full circle, because if you use the 2 to 5 word slogans and you bucketize people into these buckets, it's so easy to believe stuff that's absolutely implausible. For example, in late 2020, Trump is going around saying the military is at the strongest it's ever been. My generals are doing a fantastic job. Everything is fantastic. So there's 1 million people in our military. And somehow from the beginning of November, when the election happened, to about February of 2021, the military and those 1 million people became woke. It became decrepit. All the machinery was falling down. Everything was breaking.
We're out of bullets.
Working. We're out of bullets. Yeah, that was a big thing. We're out of bullets because in the 4.5 weeks that Biden has been here, he's completely depleted our military. Okay, if you spend more than 15 seconds in critical thought about what they're saying, then you pick that apart and you say, yeah, that's the dumbest shit I've ever heard in my life. But if you adhere to these 3-word mantras that they throw out there, the woke military, decrepit, declining military.
The woke military. I mean, has there ever been a woke military? Ever?
You're able to put yourself in a position where you'll believe just about anything. But what I would challenge the Republican brothers and sisters out there is to really give it 15 seconds of thought before you glom onto this stuff, because if you think about it, and I really believe a lot of Republican people are doing that these days, by the way.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
If you give yourself 15 seconds of thought, then you look and you say some of these things that they talk about is absolute ridiculousness. The Republican blueprint for what is going on today was clearly written in the mid to late 70s, and it has been on a path towards execution forever.
Yeah.
So what I want to say to my Republican brothers and sisters, and the guy who was fixing my boat this weekend, is take a few seconds to think about whether or not Sarah Huckabee saying all of the radical leftists want us to indoctrinate our children, whether or not that's even reasonable to even consider. You guys, every one of us, Republican, Democrat, and Independent, we know 1,000 teachers each. I don't know a single teacher that I look at and go, that's a communist indoctrinator there. That person's trying to change my boy into a girl.
It's just implausible in a state like this. If you've spent any time in this state and sat at football games or gone to the mall or coffee shops, whatever, any of the places that people gather, it's impossible to locate people that as soon as they get into these fiendish public school environments, they begin rubbing their hands together and plotting to turn these children into something unrecognizable to their parents. These are the same public schools that I went to. And I can tell you, not a radical leftist in the bunch, certainly not a plotting.
They didn't turn anybody I know gay, because the people who I know who were gay anyway.
Yeah.
And if anything, the teachers that I knew growing up, regardless of their feeling about gay individuals, they at least adhered to the Beatitudes enough to say, look, I love you as a person first and foremost. And, what's going on with whether or not I believe in your sexual orientation or how you want to portray that, it just doesn't matter because you're a kid in my classroom. There are just no indoctrinators in the state. And if there are, I'll be the first one to say they need to get the fuck out of here.
But it's a little bit, they've made this claim and they haven't shown any evidence. Who's the worst offender of what you're describing, the problem you're describing? They don't have any. There's no one that they can hold up. By now, we would have McCarthy hearings with names, but that's exactly what this is. It's like when McCarthy said, I've got the names of hundreds of communists in the State Department. Well, okay, let's have those names. I'm not going to give you any names. They say these things and everybody thinks, oh, how terrible, oh, how awful. there are these groomers in our schools that are turning, which if this is a new development, then where did the LGBTQ people that we're surrounded with right now come from? You know what I mean? If it's just a matter of it suddenly becoming an issue, then how did these people sneak through back in the Make America Great times that they want to return to? It just defies logic in a loop over and over again, that if somebody just repeats the same mantra to you over and you don't stop for a moment to do any research or critical thinking on that, of course that's how propaganda works. You suddenly find yourself just repeating this sloganeering without stopping to ask yourself for a moment if there's any possibility that it's accurate. And I caution people all the time to take a moment to challenge their own assumptions. And this is something that I do to myself to a fault, where I don't know if you've ever had this moment where you're like, wait a minute, these people believe this so strongly that maybe I'm the one that's misread the situation. Maybe I need to go do a little bit more research. You know what I mean? And then I read into what these other people are using as evidence, and it's empty. It's hollow. Like I said, there's no list of manipulative teachers that are responsible for thousands of.
I promise you one thing. And we've been ignoring the elephant in the room, so to speak, but if Sarah Huckabee Sanders knew of radical leftist indoctrinator teachers, there would be a published list of names and addresses.
Exactly.
And so every time she says about the radical left or about indoctrinators, I simply want to scream from the top of the hill, name one. Name one.
Right.
In Marianna, Arkansas, or in Bentonville, Arkansas, or anywhere. Now I can name plenty of teachers, actually more likely PTO members or those type of folks who want to indoctrinate people to a more right-wing ideology.
Absolutely.
But I can't name teachers that are indoctrinators, not one single teacher that is an indoctrinator.
So much of the LEARNS Act, I feel like, is about the reverse of the indoctrination that they're describing. It's hardcore, non-critical thinking, accepting of whatever the state tells you to believe indoctrination, which I've said to you before, I approach all of this from a standpoint of a less educated public is easier to control. Don't question the state. Just, we're the ones that you can trust. We're the ones that are going to tell you the truth. And anybody that opposes what we're saying is the radical left.
I agree with what you said, except I don't think it has to do with education. I think it just has to do with willingness to listen, to be enlightened by what's actually happening out there. It's really bright people that I know that will repeat these mantras over and over again. Yeah. And when I say bright, I mean educated, well-educated people that speak well and that repeat this stuff. Yeah. It's just awful. So
I know it's hard to understand. I feel like a lot of this is about the MAGA offering cover to people that, for whatever reason, have a pet deplorable behavior. They don't want to be held, like they want to go back to a time when it was acceptable to say awful things and not be held to account for it.
All right, I don't want to edit any more than this.
Okay. That sounds like that's how we're going to end every podcast from now on.
I don't want to edit any more than this.
Yeah, that's the end.
I've reached my editing point.